Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. You've heard of all the classic cinematic monsters: Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy. What about Erik the Orangutan? Never heard of him? Well, he'll be the subject of tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. So here he is. That's Erik the Orangutan from the 1932 Universal film Murders in the Rue Morgue, which was loosely based on Poe's story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue. And this photo came with a set of publicity stills that was sent to the museum in January of 1932 from Universal Pictures, with the compliments of Carl Laemmle, right there, who was the president of Universal. Now, Carl Laemmle's son, Carl Laemmle Jr., is the one who had the great idea back around 1931 to make the studio focus on horror films. And that's really what saved the company. He started out with the classic film Dracula, based on the novel, but also based on a popular play that was also based on the novel. So if you thought that studios making reboots and remakes and adaptations was a new thing, it's a very old thing, goes way back. So since it was already a successful franchise, it had already once been adapted to film in a German 1922 version called Nosferatu, they knew this was a pretty safe bet. And Universal was even able to get the star of the stage play, Bela Lugosi. He's the classic Dracula everyone thinks of when they think of the caped, tuxedoed Dracula with the slick back hair. That's the guy. The problem is that the author, Bram Stoker's widow, was still alive, and she liked to sue people when they made unauthorized adaptations of her husband's work. In fact, she'd ordered all the prints and negatives of Nosferatu destroyed. Of course, some of them survived, so that's why we still have the film today. So Universal had to pay big money to get the rights to make this film. Fortunately, it was a hit. So Universal decided, let's make another horror movie based on another popular work of classic literature. This time it was Frankenstein. And Frankenstein was so old, and Mary Shelley, the author, had been dead for so long, you didn't have to pay anybody any royalties for this one. So that was a bonus. They got the director, Robert Florey, who was a French sort of expressionist filmmaker, and they got Bela Lugosi. But then Bela Lugosi took one look at the script and said, I am way too good for this. I don't have any speaking parts. My beautiful face is covered with makeup. Find somebody else. Anybody can play this part. So Universal replaced him. And they also replaced the director. The new director would be the English-born James Whale. And Whale found an out-of-work, struggling actor named Boris Karloff and recruited him for the part of the monster. The rest is history. Karloff became a big horror star, followed up with films like The Mummy, and played mad scientist part, played Frankenstein's monster a few more times, and had a long and productive career. Bela Lugosi passed up what could have been a career-defining role. But instead he got typecast as being the Dracula guy, and went on to play similar characters in The Return of the Vampire and Mark of the Vampire, and later Abbott and Costello Meet Dracula. So really typecast to the extent that actually when he died, he asked to be buried in his Dracula cape because that was the character they all recognize him as. But Bela Lugosi and Robert Florey had one more shot. And they were able to adapt another work of classic literature that was also in the public domain, so they didn't have to pay anybody any royalties. And they decided, you know what? Edgar Allan Poe is a well-known name. let's make another horror film based on one of Poe's works. And the idea then is to have a good horror film, you had to have a monster, like Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, or Dracula. And Poe's stories don't have a lot of monsters. Fortunately, one of his stories has an orangutan. It's The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Problem is, it's actually a mystery story. If you haven't read it yet, it starts out with two women in an upstairs apartment. The door is locked from the inside. There's seemingly no other way to escape this apartment. And they're brutally murdered. Everybody hears the murder taking place. The police come, they break down the door. The windows are all still closed. One of the victims has had her head chopped off. The other one has been shoved up the chimney. So they said no human being could have committed such a crime and escaped. How could this be done? Is this supernatural? The police are baffled. But then Poe's detective character, Auguste Dupin, who would later appear in the sequels The Mystery of Roget and The Purloined Letter, he takes up the case. And he's able to look at the crime scene, determine that there's some hairs that are out of place, looks at the bruises on the victim's throat, and he determines that the killer must have been an escaped orangutan. And he actually is able to track down the orangutan's owner and put all the pieces together. And this was a little bit more plausible back then than it is today. People were just now seeing their first orangutans. If you're in a major city, you might never have seen one before, but you've heard all the legends, how they're so much like humans. They're so intelligent that they're basically just wild humans. So that's the basis for Poe's detective story. Universal decided to make that into a horror movie. What they did was they changed Auguste Dupin, the reclusive, eccentric detective, into Pierre Dupin, the young, dashing medical student who hears that some bodies have been dumped in the River Seine, and he wants to try to figure out what's going on, what's happening there. And his love interest, played by Sidney Fox, is Camille. And then Bela Lugosi, what's he do? He plays Dr. Miracle. It's not in the story, so don't bother to look that one up. He's a mad scientist who's trying to prove the theory of evolution the same way that any of us would try to prove the theory of evolution, by abducting women and injecting them with gorilla blood. And when they die from being injected with gorilla blood, he just dumps the bodies through a trap door in his laboratory into the River Seine, and that's how Pierre Dupin discovers them. Now, being a mad scientist doesn't really pay the bills. I mean, it costs a lot to have a nice laboratory with a trap door in it, so he has a day job. This Dr. Miracle works in a sideshow at a carnival, and he has a super intelligent gorilla. I'm not sure if it's really an orangutan. I think it's a gorilla. In the long shots, it's a guy in a gorilla costume. In close-ups, it's an actual chimpanzee they got from the zoo. But either way, Pierre and Camille decide to go to the carnival, and Erik, the super intelligent orangutan / gorilla, grabs her bonnet, and he falls for her, but so does Dr. Miracle. So he decides, I need to abduct that woman, take her to my lab, and inject her with Erik, the super intelligent gorilla's blood. So in the middle of the night, he sends out Erik, the super intelligent gorilla / orangutan, and he abducts her, carries her back to the laboratory, and fortunately, Pierre shows up just in time to chase the gorilla across the rooftops and rescue Camille. Oh, spoiler alert, he rescued Camille. And that's basically the movie. So it doesn't have a whole lot to do with Poe's detective story, except borrowing the last name Dupin and the gorilla. So these pieces right here were sent to the museum when they're trying to promote it. It's actually sent by Joe Wheel, the director of exploitation for Universal Pictures. And his job was to try to get newspaper articles written about this movie, to try to stage publicity stunts, like having a hearse parked outside the theater in case somebody dies of fright while they're watching the movie. It can haul you off. And also going to local libraries and seeing them put up a lobby display about the murders in the Rue Morgue. Or in this case, going to the Poe Museum and seeing if the Poe Museum would have put up a display of their lobby cards and hand out publicity materials. And yeah, most of these photographs here feature the stars Sidney Fox and Leon Ames, and we don't have any with Bela Lugosi in them. So they're really pushing to make Sidney Fox a star, partly because she was Carl Laemmle's mistress. The problem is she lacked any real acting talent, and she had kind of a grating voice. So she didn't make it very far in Hollywood. In fact, she only lived for another 10 years after The Murders in the Rue Morgue came out. Leon Ames here, however, went on to a long, successful career all the way up until 1993. I think his last movie was Peggy Sue Got Married with the great Nicolas Cage and Kathleen Turner. And along with all these publicity materials, they also sent their new tie-in book, The Murders in the Rue Morgue and Other Tales of Horror by Edgar Allan Poe, illustrated with scenes from the Universal Photoplay presented by Carl Laemmle. And all throughout you'll see these photos of Bela Lugosi as Dr. Miracle bossing around his ape. There he is in his laboratory. Here he is in the carnival. But these photographs appear all throughout the book, even when they're not specifically illustrating a story. So these are great documents of Universal Pictures' early attempts to get Poe onto the screen. So why didn't Erik the Orangutan become the big hit that Dracula or Frankenstein or the Mummy or the Wolfman became? I think it's because the movie wasn't terribly good. The acting wasn't great, but also they had some pretty cringe-inducing lines like this.
You're like a song the girls of Provence sing on May Day, and like the dancing in Normandy on May Day, and like the wine in Burgundy on May Day. Oh, Camille, I love.
But otherwise, the movie is kind of unjustly maligned. It's not terrible. Robert Florey's visual sense is great. He creates these expressionistic sets that are derived from German cinema of the time. And after Dracula, I think this is Bela Lugosi's best role. As Dr. Miraculous, he really relishes the sinister, evil, over-the-top aspects of his character. So I really think it's worth the watch. And while we're at it, I have one more piece from the film. This one didn't come from Universal. It's a movie poster. This was far from the last time that The Murders in the Rue Morgue was adapted to screen. In fact, it's since been adapted with actors by the likes of Jason Robards, Val Kilmer, and Rebecca De Mornay. But I still think the 1932 version's the best. If you haven't seen it, give it a look and let us know down in the comments what you think. And if you'd like to help the Poe Museum preserve precious Poe pieces like these, why not support the Poe Museum or become a member at poemuseum.org. Until next time, thanks for joining us, and I'll leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing Poe Museum cat stuff.